Hi, and thanks for tuning in to Genesis Academy. I'm Dr. Michael Windhauser. This talk was originally delivered in early December of 2012 to a group of Christian high school students as part of a program entitled Worldview Wednesdays. And it was this 2-hour block of time each Wednesday that students have the opportunity to converse with individuals, professionals from different disciplines. And this particular Wednesday, it was my turn to discuss with them something related to science and how a Christian works and functions in the world of science. So I entitled my talk, In Plain Sight, How a Christian Scientist Sees the World. I'd like to begin by asking you to remember that before FedEx, which is a very familiar delivery service today, there was Federal Express, begun in 1980 as a new venture in overnight delivery. And it was wildly successful, based in Memphis, really revolutionized private package delivery when things really had to be there overnight. Later on in 1994, the company reorganized as FedEx. And now you typically see the FedEx boxes and FedEx trucks around the country, delivering overnight as well as less swiftly, 2-day delivery, that sort of thing. They even have FedEx ground delivery. So my question to you is, what is the Federal Express or the FedEx logo? You see the planes, you see the trucks, you see the cars on the road. And what exactly is the logo for FedEx? Now, the logo actually has two parts. And no, it's not Fed and X as the two parts. FedEx is the logo, but there is a second part that maybe you haven't seen, maybe you have, and that is the arrow. If you look between the E and the X, that shape is a rightward facing arrow. Many people have never seen the arrow unless it's been pointed out to them, and I was one of those people where somebody, when I was in Memphis, pointed out to me that there's an arrow in the logo. And the first question you ask is, well, that's interesting. I wonder if that was intentionally designed that way by the group that created the logo. And now that I've seen the arrow will always be obvious to me. I will always see the arrow when I look at the FedEx logo. And you may be in that situation too, where this is the first time you've actually seen the arrow. And from now on, moving forward, you will never not see the arrow. The arrow will always be present as part of the logo. And as a scientist, this, I think, represents a useful kind of an illustration where there are people who see the big picture of the logo, but then there are people who see a different portion of the logo, and they see the arrow as well as the big word FedEx, and they wonder, was that placed there intentionally? And they reason backwards that this really looks like it was an intentional design because there was no spacing between the E and the X. And it turns out in this case, of course, that the arrow was intentionally placed by the logo designer, and the reasoning would have been correct. The supposition, the presumption of intelligent design would have been correct for this particular logo, because we can go back and check with the original designer. And throughout this talk, this will serve as a useful illustration of what I mean by the term in plain sight. So in other words, the FedEx logo is in plain sight, but so is the arrow. But oftentimes people don't see the arrow. And when you do see the arrow, the question arises, was the arrow intentionally designed? And if we use that as an illustration of the world, of the universe, of everything that we see in plain sight every day, and many things that we can't see but can visualize through various means, the question is, do you see the arrow, and do you wonder, is that there intentionally? Was that designed into the bigger picture for a reason? And so these things are in plain sight, but the scientific question is it intentional? Now, before we move into the body of the talk, I want to really summarize basic ideas that you'll hear in this talk. One is that as a Christian, or as a scientist who is also a Christian, and part of a group of scientists who are Christians, we see the same world that you see, the world that is in plain sight. We use the same scientific method. We use the same data generated from various sources as non-Christian scientists, and we often draw the same conclusion because the data are the data. But Christian scientists also see clear signs of purpose and design in the universe. In other words, Christian scientists not only see the logo of FedEx, they see the arrow, and they infer intentional design by a creator God who's separate from the creation, but whose reality is confirmed in several ways, through the details of creation, through logic, by examining history, and by a unique written record of history in the Bible, and by personal experience. So there are at least 5 ways that the existence of a creator God can be confirmed. Now this worldview, the Christian worldview, I propose makes more coherent sense of biology, chemistry, and physics than does a naturalistic or an atheistic worldview, and it represents real knowledge in a real world, and thus it provides a sufficient base for a society with enduring morals and values. And that's my proposition for you to consider as we go along. That's what I'm going to say. That is what I would like for you to listen for and think about as we go along. So where are we going? We've introduced the arrow. We're going to turn next to a section about what really is science, something that no scientist really likes to try and explain because there are so many nuances and different ways of approaching it. Then we'll go to, well, if that's what science is, what does being a Christian have to do with being a scientist or doing science? And then if that is the case, then how do I, as a Christian scientist in the world today, see the world as a result of my worldview? How do I interpret the world? And then we'll turn in the last portions of the talk to examples of how I react, how I, as a Christian scientist, see the arrow in science that I come in contact with. And this is just simply what the journals that I read, the things that I'm familiar with, and little tidbits of information that I come across that I might interpret in a slightly different way because I see the arrow as well as the logo, the bigger picture. The final section of the talk will cover what I call detective work or following the breadcrumbs. And the idea here is simply that if the Christian worldview is an appropriate and accurate worldview, we really have some detective work to do to understand what we see in the world, because it doesn't always look like it was intentionally created. There are errors and problems that have arisen over time. And so to distinguish that from the work of a creator requires some detective work and following the breadcrumbs. And I think by looking at the specifics and the details of some of those, I think we can begin to approach that process. And that's where I really hope you'll stay and listen and enjoy those specific examples of following the breadcrumbs.